The Social War, a war fought between Italian rebels and Rome. Well, the question is, why did it happen? Well, to answer that, I have to go quite a ways back. The plebeians of Rome became ever increasingly disgruntled with the nobility, with the consuls, with anyone in power. They felt as though they were overlooked. So they got together and they created the Tribune of Plebs. And this was put in place so that it could check the power of the consul and the Senate and ensure that the plebs were not left out of these decisions. A man by the name of Tiberius Gracchus served as tribune. Tiberius Gracchus comes in and he has a lot of reforms that he'd like to pass. He institutes his agrarian law and essentially seeing that the Italian people who were not granted citizenship in Rome were disenfranchised. He was seeing that they were not allowed to prosper. And he noticed that as the years went on, these Italians who had helped Rome and supported them in all their wars and all their endeavors and all their expansion grew poorer and poorer, and the rich grew richer and richer. Ever increasingly, the rich would use slave labor instead of hiring these Italians, which obviously led to those Italians not able to find work. So Gracchus in 133 proposes the law that will take the land that was illegally seized from the Roman nobility and give it back to the Italians. Obviously, much to the chagrin of these nobles, they were very upset that it passed. And now they had to find a way to implement the giving of land back to the Italians. The next year, fearing even more reforms, the senators forbade Gracchus from running as tribune of the plebs. However, Gracchus had obviously grown immensely in popularity because of his reforms. His followers, they cast out all other candidates and did not allow anyone to run for tribune except for Gracchus. Sadly, this rebellion was ultimately put down. All conspirators were slain. Tiberius Gracchus and all of his loyal followers were killed and tossed into the Tiber River. The people lamented Gracchus's death. They began to lose faith in the government of Rome. But the nobility celebrated his death. They hoped that his reforms and ideas would die with him. Now, unfortunately, Gracchus's law had been passed, and the distribution of these lands was already in effect and had to be undertaken. Unfortunately, this led to numerous problems. Who could prove where the borders were? Who could prove who owned what land? Who really owned the land? Was this land truly seized illegally? It became a massive, massive cluster. And nobody really had any way of proving definitively what the truth was. And there was no really good way to implement the giving back of this land. So the people that were opposed to Gracchus' law decided to ask a very famous man, Scipio Aemilianus, to support them. Now, Scipio reluctantly agreed, and in the Senate he said he did not personally disagree with Gracchus' reforms. However, the implementation was flawed. Now, obviously, the senators and the people all agreed on this. So they decided that it was best, instead of giving it into the hands of senators who had been involved in this, they gave it to one man, Tuditanus. Unfortunately, after surveying, he realized that this was a pretty much impossible task, and there would be no real way to implement it. So, to avoid his duty, Tuditanus shipped off for some battle and combat in Illyria that he just absolutely needed to do. So, a great ploy from him. He's like, oh, they gave me the job, an impossible task. I'll just go wage some war somewhere, get me out of this impossible job. I can't do this. Fair enough. You got to do what you got to do. Obviously, Scipio, was not wrong at all. But because of really not taking either side, he had both sides of the reformers and the senators upset with him because he wasn't really one way or the other picking a side. And in fact, to the nobility who had asked him to help them, they kind of felt like perhaps he was a little bit too relaxed and too accepting of Gracchus's law. And to the plebeians, of course, they were upset that he basically said it was a flawed law. And while he didn't disagree with the reforms, he did disagree with the implementation of it and didn't know if there really was a way to implement. Now, despite this, he still tries, and everyone obviously, putting Tuditanus in that position gave him the opportunity. But again, because that doesn't work out, there's a lot of anger from all sides at Scipio Aemilianus. So as Scipio is, he's just in his house, and he doesn't know, what he wants to say or what he wants to do. He has to address the Senate, and he has to address the people, and he sees, the clamoring from both sides and the hostility, and he doesn't know what to do, and so he's planning his speech. Sitting in his room, tired, pacing back and forth, he just doesn't know what to write. How can he mend this fractured relationship of people and Senate? He needs to find a way to get the people to trust the government again. The public turmoil must be mended, and it will be mended by Scipio Aemilianus' speech. Well, unfortunately for everybody, Scipio Aemilianus did the only logical thing he could do, and died that very night before he was to give the speech. Now, there's some people that allege, the ancient sources are very, very particular that he was murdered. They say maybe servants were snuck in and suffocated him. They say perhaps his mother-in-law, who was a part of the Gracchus family, they say, perhaps these people conspired to poison him. There's tons and tons of rumors on the death of Scipio Aemilianus. I don't find any of these to be true, and I completely understand why at the time, especially with all the political turmoil going on, these rumors popped up, were so easily spread in that time because, you're looking for someone to blame. But the reality is, as far as I can tell, Scipio Aemilianus died of natural causes. I find all the alleged murder plots to be untenable. But I digress. We are left with the fact that Scipio Aemilianus, the day before he was to give his speech, died. So, some time later, Gracchus' younger brother and Flaccus still tried to appease those that supported Gracchus, and they wanted to get his law and reforms effectually done. Now, a man by the name of Marcus Livius Drusus set up 12 colonies, and the plebs began to side with him. And they trusted this man now, and kind of took a little bit of the fire away from Gracchus and Flaccus. So Gracchus and Flaccus themselves said, well, if we start a colony, we can kind of swing this plebeian support back to us and get us into power so that we can now enact Gracchus' laws. So they set up this colony in Africa. They went out there, surveyed it, set things up. Unfortunately for them, due to conditions completely outside of their control, the colony was never going to be able to be set up. And there was a lot of reasons and stories that the sources give for why the colony could not go through, but effectually it just had a lot of, we'll call them zoning problems, and it's said at some point that wolves trashed the stake markers, and it's who knows what really happened, but all we do know for sure is that it just was not going to be it was not something that was going to be mended. And this colony in Africa was never going to be, again, not to the fault of anyone in particular, just forces outside of their control. Both the Senate, who probably wouldn't have wanted it anyway, and Gracchus and Flaccus. But regardless, this colony was destined to fail. And so the Senate revoked permission for this colony. Gracchus was furious, and so he went into the Senate with many of his angry supporters. They wanted to protest this, and they wanted to punish the senators for revoking this, because they thought this was a targeted attack at them to ruin their credibility and their chances at making a political move for themselves. So those that supported Gracchus, when they see him angrily staring at a man who was simply just trying to comfort Gracchus, came up to him, he said, "It's okay, these things happen, you'll get back on your feet, you'll figure this out. It's not your fault, it's nobody's fault. There'll be another time, another place. You can mend this, and perhaps another colony can sprout, or a new idea will form for you." But Gracchus just stared at the man, anger. Unfortunately, his supporters took this as a sign to kill the man. And they did. Right there, Senate chambers, they murdered this man. This caused a massive panic. Gracchus and Flaccus were now barricaded in with their supporters, but quickly they surrendered, were put to death for causing a revolt. Now, Gracchus and Flaccus, again, they did go in there. I think it's important to mention that they went in there with clubs and daggers because they were planning on, if the Senate really truly did reject this colony, to stage some type of revolt. So I think it's a little disingenuous to kind of give them the pass by saying, "Oh, well, they didn't want that man killed," and then the mob essentially misinterpreted Gracchus' demands and killed that guy, which started the whole thing. They surrendered and they're killed for it. And make no mistake, I think that this was going to happen regardless. And at some point, I think a signal was going to be given, because there's no way the Senate was not going to revoke the permission of the colony in Africa. So, yes, that man died. Yes, it was probably not exactly the way that Gracchus and Flaccus had hoped it to go, but nonetheless, there was a clear revolt in plan anyway. With their death, Gracchus's law dies with them. His younger brother, not able to pass his reforms, and dead now, and all of his supporters being punished, it effectively ended Gracchus's law. And now we see that the very people, the rich nobility and senators who had grabbed up all this land, had, after the span of about 10 years, gotten exactly what they wanted. Gracchus's law was passed to the wayside, gone. And those land reforms and giving this land back to the people would never happen. So the Italians, they grew poorer still. Unemployment was rampant as more and more slaves filled in for the jobs of the everyday Italians. So two men decided they'd had enough. Saturnius and Glaucia. So Saturnius and Glaucia try to rise to power. And again, they're using the same kind of populist rhetoric that Gracchus would use. Saturnius and Glaucia were a little different in their, in their reforms, but again, still people, still trying to give power back to the people. But these two men, with their populist reforms, sparked the ire of many of the nobles. A man by the name of Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius, the son of Metellus Macedonius, detested them. And he had good reason for it, as we'll see, but I digress. A man by the name of Nonius was running against them, and fearing that their power would be revoked and political punishments enforced on them, they murdered Nonius. His assassination was covered up with the help of Gaius Marius, and Saturnius was raised to power. With this, they banished Metellus's father, Metellus Macedonius, with the help of Gaius Marius. If you watch the Gaius Marius video, the Life of Marius video I posted, you'll know about this. I'll just briefly cover it here. Saturnius and Glaucia pass what they call their agrarian law, and before they, wanted to pass it, they put a clause into it that every senator had to accept an oath saying that whatever the tribune of the plebs decided, the people decided, they would accept and not go against, and not offer any counter to, which, is kind of insane and goes against everything that the senators would stand for. But so that they had a meeting, and Gaius Marius, who was again in the same camp as Saturnius and Glaucia, stood up. And even though he was a populist and was for the people, he said this was the most ludicrous idea he'd ever heard. It was idiotic. He would never accept an oath that forced something so dumb. And so, Metellus, the father and the son, were thrilled. And the senators and the nobility were thrilled. They said, wow, Marius is on our side on this? This is great. This is better than anything we could have hoped for. And a few days passed, and then they went and met, and it was time to take the oath. And much to their surprise and anger, Marius went up first, took the oath in front of all the people, which forced them now all to take the oath unless they wanted to be cast out. So with the punishment of banishment and exile from Rome, they must accept the oath that they will accept the passing of the agrarian law from the tribune and what the people vote. Not a great look for the senators. Marius backstabs them, tells them he's not going to take the oath, and then he does, which forces all of them to take the oath. And one by one, the senators go down and take these oaths until it comes to our good friend, Metellus Macedonius, who refuses to take the oath. And his friends beg him. They say, please, please take the oath. His son wants him to take the oath. Just please take the oath. But he says, his famous line is, and there's a little bit more in detail of this in the last video, but, to just sum this up, he says, it's very easy for a man to do good and not do evil. But what makes a man good is to do the right thing, even when it's presenting danger to himself. So he is willing to stand up for what he believes in. He thinks this is a ludicrous oath. He thinks this will lead to further problems down the line, the further degradation of the Republic. And he's kind of right. He's actually spot on with that. He's actually 100% in the right. But nonetheless, he is exiled. But the crowd is so upset that he doesn't take the oath that they want him condemned to death. Luckily, there's enough supporters of him there, knights and nobility, that defend him and kind of form this wall around him to try and protect him. But he immediately shuts it down and accepts his exile. He says, I want no faction raised in my name. I don't want to have any bloodshed in the city that I love. I will be exiled. And he goes, in time, the people will realize that they've made a mistake and invite me back, or it's better that I'm gone because I don't belong here. And with that, he left and went to Rhodes. Now, this is, a massive win at this point for the populist, Saturnius and Glaucia, now risen to power. And the consul elections have arrived now. Marcus Antonius was elected consul. He is the grandfather of Marcus Antonius, of the same name, the man who was in Caesar's second triumvirate. Anyway, you obviously know him, Mark Antony, and this is the grandfather of Mark Antony. So at this point now, Marcus Antonius is in, and Glaucia is running for the second consul position. and he's running against a man named Mimius. Now, Mimius was incredibly well liked and a very good orator and statesman. And they kind of realized, Glaucia realized, I can't beat this guy, and I'm going to lose the consulship. So just like they did with Nonius for Saturnius, they said, well, we could just incite a bunch of plebes to kill him. That'll work, right? I mean, it worked great the first time. We didn't get in trouble. So they incited a mob to kill Mimius. And yes, the mob kills Mimius, and now, Glaucia is run for consul and win. Unfortunately, though, this death, unlike Nonius, could not be covered up. There's a story about how the knights kind of come to arrest the Saturnius, who Marius was actually kind of aiding in his escape. As I said, Gaius Marius was friends with these guys, so even though he's kind of this well-respected general, he still was born into poverty, raised up from nothing. Don't forget, Gaius Marius was the first person to institute poor people into the military, so he accepted that you didn't even have to have land for the requirement was you must be a landowner. He removed that, so he allowed for a lot of upward mobility of the populace with that, act. And obviously, being from humble beginnings himself, he was a populist. Marius is kind of defending Saturnius from these guys, but he goes over to them, and Marius, even though he was a populist, was not given as much grief for the reforms as Saturnius and Glaucia. No one, it had been pretty apparent that where Marius' skills lied was as a general. He was a great general, one of Rome's best. He was not an orator. He was no great speaker. He was not that charismatic, and he didn't have great social graces. So he left these things to Saturnius and Glaucia. So the knights and the nobility kind of, even though they knew Marius didn't like them, and they didn't really like Marius, they were much more inclined to believe that all of those negative traits were the fault of Saturnius. So they tried to, incite Marius against Saturnius. And obviously, with Glaucia having killed Mimius, they wanted him dead. He had Saturnius hidden in his house, and he kept running back and forth, the knights and Saturnius. And to avoid suspicion of either side, he was, guys, I have really bad diarrhea. That's why I need to keep going. Like every couple minutes, I gotta just go to the bathroom. I'm definitely not, conspiring with your enemy right now. I'm totally not having a conversation with a guy you're trying to kill. And Saturnius, I'm definitely not talking to the people who want to kill you right now. I promise. I just have diarrhea. But eventually, Saturnius figures out what's going on, and Glaucia, who has just killed Mimius, has now basically started a revolt in the middle of the Roman Forum, and Saturnius joins them. And Saturnius and Glaucia basically convince their conspirators. They say, "Hey, let's just surrender to Marius," because Marius very quickly shuts off their water, takes control of the men, and they are not dumb. They know they're not winning a fight against Marius. And Marius genuinely believed, once he'd heard about the death of Mimius, that Glaucia had went much too far. And I think this is kind of one of those cases where, if you look at Marius, he was probably not thrilled with Saturnius and the death of Nonius. And I think once he saw them also take out Mimius, it kind of all clicked in his head, like, yeah, maybe these aren't the best guys, and this needs to be shut down. You can't just, we don't support revolts, we just can't be done. So he shuts off the water, and again, they're locked in the forum. They can't compete with Marius and Marius's men. So Saturnius convinces, associates to stand down and surrender. Marius accepts their surrender, arrests them, and then the people now want them dead so much for this revolt. And the senators and the knights, they want them killed. So Marius locks them up in the Senate chambers. And he says, we're going to just deliberate what's going on. We need to have like a solid plan here. And we're just going to talk about their guilt. And really what Marius is doing is trying to save these men's lives. I mean, despite their evil actions and him putting down this little insurrection, he still likes these men. They're his friends. They're, essentially putting his policies that he likes forward. So he wants to spare them. And that's not what happens, because the people rip the tiles off of the Senate roof and stone these men to death. So not a great way to go, but they literally pry the tiles off of the Senate chambers and stone Saturnius Glaucia and all of those supporters to death. Not a single one of the insurrectionists survive. You have, we go back to Flaccus. Flaccus is kind of the first person who gives a different idea than Gracchus. Now, Gracchus and his brother, they wanted to give the land back to the Italians. Flaccus proposed something different. He said, why don't we give the Italians citizenship? If we give them citizenship, they'll be equal to Romans. And that way, it'll be better for their employment, they'll be treated better, have all the same laws as Romans. This could mend the relationship. However, the Senate refused outright. And as we know, Flaccus was killed for his, revolt, more or less. They did kill someone and incite a revolt. So, much like the other reformers, Saturnius Glaucia, Tiberius Gracchus, Gracchus's brother Gracchus, and Flaccus, all put to death. And so this aggravated the Italian subjects, because they thought, hey, everybody who is trying to help us gets killed. I mean, and I think it's very hard to separate that these men did wrong actions and committed political assassinations. And it's very hard to separate their wrong actions as a poor Italian subject. It's very hard to go, well, they deserved it, when they're the only people that are helping you. I mean, it's the devil, so yeah, the Senate and the reformers both might be in the wrong, but at least the reformers are on my side, and right now I'm starving to death. So yeah, I'm pretty upset that they keep killing the guys that are trying to help me. Completely understandable. So again, we talked about Marcus Livius Drusus, who had gained a lot of plebeian support and took away a good amount from Gracchus and Flaccus. But Drusus, a lot of that support was not just from colonies. He promised the Italians that he would get them citizenship. So obviously, they're all on his side. Now, the Senate and Knight class never really got along, because, the Senate's, they're technically the top they're the top of society. And the Knights are the middle ground, and then you have the plebeian class. You got the merchants thrown there, but I'm just saying, in general, you got plebeians, knights, and senators, and the nobility. So, there's this back and forth between the senates and the knight classes. And some of the senators, obviously, as we see, Saturnius Glaucia, there are people who are supporters of Gracchus in the Senate, but I digress. So Drusus, is really trying to hammer home that we're going to extend citizenship to all Italians. The knights are getting increasingly paranoid about this, because now they kind of think, hey, if we give citizenship to all these plebeians, even if we're elevated to a higher status or more equal status to the senators, a lot of our lands are going to be taken and given to these people. And perhaps with them in power, a more powerful position, there's going to be less space for us. So even if we are, quote unquote, equal to the senators, we're going to be worse off than we are now. So the senators that are on that conservative side are afraid of the knights spilling into into the knights coming and taking their positions, and the knights are afraid of the plebeians coming and taking their positions. So it's this, a lot of fear coming from all these sides, and they don't want to permit this citizenship for this influx of, shifting of power and economic resources. So the Senate, has a few people who are well invested in helping the Italians gain citizenship. Now, unfortunately for, you know, the populace, if you are a plebeian and you're looking to get this reform and get this citizenship, the knight class in Rome said, we've had enough. We don't care about this equal position to the Senate and making a Senate up of knights and senators. No, no, no. Because when we influx you guys, it's going to cost us more. So the knights got together and they banished multitude of senators that were in support giving the Italian citizenship, including, I think, the biggest stain on this from any one of the knights or anyone involved in these banishments was banishing Lucius Mummius, who, again, was not only a victor in Lusitania, but was integral and won the Achaean War. So, a great man. And perhaps Lucius Mummius was he gets this rap of a guy who maybe didn't understand the value of art and things and was a little bit, but that's because he was, again, not that he was a commoner, but he was a man of the people. And I think he was a very practical guy who cared about not necessarily the value of artwork, but the intrinsic value of things. So, but and again, he saw the way the Italians were beat down. So this banishment really was, I think, out of all the banishments, the most unjust. But again, in their fear for the rising of this plebeian class, the knights cast out many senators that supported their citizenship. So again, just completely in fear of the Italians being elevated to citizenship, they cast out these senators. And now Drusus, is hated by both sides because Drusus, who's been promising the Italian citizenship, they realize, hey, you're not going to be able to pass this. Our senators are getting banished. Anyone who supports us is being banished. You're not going to be able to get us citizenship, and you promised us. And the nobility can't stand Drusus because they believe that he's incited all this into the plebeians. So, into the plebs. He believes that he's incited this desire to get citizenship. And in a way he did, but there were many other, and it's very important to talk about Gracchus, the Gracchi brothers in general, Flaccus. There were many people, and it's not like they had these revolutionary reforms. I mean, they just saw that the people were suffering, and they tried their best to help them. Now, but all that being said, Drusus is hated by everybody now because he's failed to give them citizenship, and because of the increase in hostility of the plebeians towards the Senate and the knight class, now the Senates and the knights hate Drusus. Unfortunately for Drusus, and we don't know who did it, he was assassinated. Like I said, everyone's against this guy. You couldn't keep your promise on citizenship, and you've insulted and you've incited the plebeian class to revolt. So that means now the knights and the senators hate you for, getting them all agitated. So obviously killing Drusus, not the best move, but he was assassinated. We don't know who assassinated him, but he was assassinated. So now the Italians, who are, again, poorer and poorer each day, unemployed, rampant, don't have any measure of really coming out of this, they decide it's time to revolt. Because the senators keep being, any senator that supports them is banished. Drusus was murdered. Anyone else who has tried to help them has been murdered. Enough is enough. We must revolt. And in secret, they organized an exchanging of hostages between each of their towns. A praetor by the name of Servilius heard rumor of the hostages in Asculum. He rushed and demanded an explanation from the town. So the people there began to panic because they realized, hey, we might be outed. They might know, and this could lead to disaster for all of us. So they killed Servilius. All of the Romans in Asculum were then slaughtered, their property stolen or destroyed. And this marks the official start of the social war. On one side, you have the Italian rebels who seek citizenship in Rome, and on the other side, you have Rome. So the Marsi, the Pelagini, the Vestini, the Marrucini, and after them, the Picentines, the Frontani, the Hirpini, the Pompeians, Vinosini, the Apulians, Lucanians, and the Samnites all revolt. Each one of these people sent ambassadors telling Rome that despite the Italians' help in building Rome to what it is today, they would have never been granted equal status. So, effectively, if they grant them equal status, the revolt will be over. Give us our citizenship, let us be equal to you, and with that, the war's done. Rome completely refused to grant them citizenship, and both sides mobilized for war. So, breaking down the commanders or the generals in these wars for both sides, we have Sextus, consul Sextus Julius Caesar, who was the uncle of Julius Caesar that we all know. There was also another consul the year later, who was Lucius Julius Caesar, and he was the second cousin of Julius Caesar that we know. So he is kind of responsible for, or one of the statesmen responsible for, I don't know if I want to use the term assassinating, but killing Saturnius. Anyway, at the outset of the war, Lucius Julius Caesar was the consul. On one side, we have consul Sextus Julius Caesar. Under him, you have Publius Lentulus, Titus Didius, Licinius Crassus, Cornelius Sulla, Marcellus. Under consul Rudolus, you have Gnaeus Pompeius, who is the father of Pompey the Great, part of the first triumvirate. You have Quintus Capio, Gaius Perpenna, Gaius Marius, our friend, and Valerius Messala. So those men make up the Roman commanders. Obviously, like I said, you have to consider Lucius Julius Caesar is also a part of this. The sources, when they mention this, they kind of interchangeably mention Lucius and Sextus, and there's I just think it was a little bit of a confusion. Lucius Caesar tries to siege Acernia and is defeated, and they lose like 2,000 men. And then later on at Achaea or Acerea, he defeats the Samnites and kills 6,000 of Mutulus's men. Anyway, I just want to be clear that there's two Caesars in this war. We know that Lucius was given a triumph for Acerea. That's all I'm going to consider him for. Every other time I mention Julius Caesar, I'm going to be talking about Sextus Julius Caesar. Just know that there is a potentiality for certain battles having been Lucius Julius Caesar, though I'm pretty certain that Sextus Julius Caesar was responsible for all of the later battles, and Lucius Julius Caesar was only responsible for the first two. I digress. So here on the screen, we have a list of the consul Sextus Julius Caesar and his subordinates. On the right side, we have consul Rudolus and his subordinates. And now we are going to bring the generals for the Italian rebels. The most prestigious of all of them was Quintus Poppaedius Silo, Gaius Papius Mutilus, Marcus Lamponius, Titus Lafrenius, Gaius Pontilius, Marius Ignatius, Gaius Vidicilius, Herius Asinius, and Vettius Scaton. Again, these are all the men. Now, for the Italian rebels, it's kind of important to understand that each of these men were kind of propped up from their town. So if their town or their community rebelled, they would be the consul for that town. And so each one of these men is kind of an individual leader, but they're all grouped together in this war against Rome. So while the consul and the generals under them are, specifically under those consuls, each of the rebel commanders are kind of their own leaders. Anyway, I digress. So Vettius Scaton kills 200 of Sextus Julius Caesar's men. In this case, this one is the one I'm talking about. This is probably Lucius Julius Caesar. Either way, Cernia, which was at the time allied to Rome, is besieged and eventually starved out. So that's a big win for Scaton at the start. Marius Ignatius captures Venafrum. Perpenna was defeated and 4,000 of his men were killed. Rutilius gave command of his remaining forces to Gaius Marius, being obviously one of the most respected generals at the time. So, right at the start of this social war, we see that the rebels are off to a much, much faster start. So, Perpenna is, obviously beaten, 4,000 men killed, Ignatius capturing Venafrum, Acernia captured. It's like just they hit the ground rolling. The rebels were ready for this war, and I think Rome, not only were they surprised and the murder of Servilius and all this, I don't think they really expected a revolt, which is kind of insane when you realize how much social distress had been going on and all the turmoil in politics and literal murders that were taking place. You would think, and I mean, the one that always gets me about this is you look at Scipio Aemilianus, who is one of the most well-respected figures at the time, and just because of this specific infraction and how he is not able to solve it, his whole legacy is tarnished. It's kind of crazy, but anyway, let's not get ahead of ourselves. So Perpenna is defeated, and now Marcus Lamponius kills 800 of Crassus's forces and pushed the rest into a defensive position. So Gaius Papias captures Nola. This is not through war, just kind of basically convinces the men to fight with him. 2,000 men were given the opportunity to join him, and they agreed. However, the officers were all murdered, including Lucius Postumus, who was executed. So Stabi, Minervium, and Salernum are all captured because they fear Papias. Many of the surrounding towns were so afraid that they just said, hey, we'll support you. Just don't come destroy us. And so he received 11,000 soldiers from them, and with the combined forces laid siege to Asarea. So Sextus Julius Caesar came to fight, and this is again one of those ones where this could be Lucius, but whatever. Sextus Julius Caesar came to fight, and he enlisted a bunch of Numidian cavalrymen. So the rebels at the time had freed one of Jugurtha's sons from prison. So as soon as they saw the Numidian cavalrymen, they presented their king to them. A bunch of the Numidians defected to join the rebels' side. Caesar still attacked, and he actually ended up killing 6,000 rebels, but decided to withdraw. And so with his withdrawal, even more of the surrounding towns fell. And all of the Romans who were inside and Roman sympathizers were put to death by the rebels. At this point, Rutilius and Marius built these bridges to cross and defend this river. However, Scaton, who was doing His utmost, as we know, uh, saw that Rudolus had crossed the bridge and ferociously launched his assault, driving Rudulus's men back into the river, killing them, slaughtering Rudulus's forces, and Rudolus himself perishes in this battle. Marius, just further downstream, senses that something's wrong, and as he sees the corpses of Roman soldiers flowing down the river, he knows the battle has started, and so he rushes across the river and takes the camp of Scaton, burning the tents, making sure that they have nowhere to go, and Scaton must retreat completely out, his encampment destroyed. Rudolus and his dead men were sent to Rome, and it disheartened the people in the Senate so much that the Senate decreed that from now on, the bodies of the dead were to be buried where they were slain. The Italian rebels also passed their own decrees agreeing with this sentiment. They thought it good. And this is one of the, I think, very interesting points in history. I mean, you see your consul coming back dead. It's so, it's affected them so much that they forever put in place that the bodies are now to be buried where they're slain, which was it's a very big deal. And I don't think that should be discounted. Now, with Rudolus killed, someone needed to take command. And Marius was a little bit too old at this point, and, he just, even though he was the most competent general, he just didn't want to do it, So, Caepio, Quintus Servilius Caepio, the son of Quintus Servilius Caepio, who was the son of Quintus Servilius Caepio. So, if you know, we're going to do a little dissection now on the least favorite series of people, the Caepios. So Quintus Servilius Caepio of Lusitania was the one who re-sparked the war with Viriathus, only to have him assassinated and end the war with the same terms. So just to further his political career, had a man assassinated. Then his son is responsible for the disaster at Arusio during the Cimbrian War, one of the single bloodiest battles and biggest losses in Roman history. Now you have another Caepio here, the son of that man, who was responsible for Arusio. Now, Caepio is shamed by his father's defeat, and he really wants to make up for that. Being given command of Rudulus's forces, he starts racking up fights, and he wins them. He's doing pretty well, actually. However, Pompedius, or Silo, the most competent of all the rebel generals, understands that this man has a weakness. In his ambition to make up for his father's failures, he might be a little reckless. And much like his grandfather and his father before him, recklessness is in their blood. So Silo approaches him, and he tells Caepio that he has decided to defect to Rome. Caepio completely believes this, and he's thrilled. And he says, "Take me to your forces, and we'll ambush them and crush them." Silo agrees, says, of course, I'll take you right to them. He leads them up, and as soon as they get to the top of the hill, Silo gives his men the command to attack, and they launch their own counter-ambush, completely wiping out Caepio's forces. Caepio himself is killed in this ambush. The rest of the men go to Marius's command, and now, Marius has got a job to do as an old head. There's a battle, as a saying that happened where Marius and Silo both tried to, bait each other into these engagements. And there's a very funny story of Silo, who is watching Marius's forces, fortified on this encampment. "Marius, if you're such a great general, why don't you come out and fight me?" And Marius says in reply, "No, Silo, if you're such a great general, why don't you make me fight you?" Which is, that's a great little back and forth. At this point, Sextus Caesar led 35,000 men, but was ambushed by Marius Ignatius. Wasn't too bad. They survived the ambush, they regroup, and with the help of some additional reinforcements, went to relieve Asarea, which Papias still was sieging. Sulla, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man who did not like Marius very well, teamed up with him, and together they defeated the Marsians who had attacked them. 6,000 Marsians were killed, and even more were captured. The Marsians were actually very much liked, seen as one of the tribes of Rome with the most combat prowess. So they would actually, at the time, even throughout history, not be awarded a triumph if you got a victory over them, because that's how much they respected the Marsians. So, just important to note, this was a very important victory that Marius commanded. 6,000 Marsians killed, a very elite fighting force, and goes to show that even in his old age, Marius was still an effective leader, was still an effective general. So Vitacilius, Lafrenius, and Vettius Scaton combined to fight Gnaeus Pompeius. They forced him to take refuge in Firmum. He, seeing their combined forces, decided his best effort was to just lock himself in the city, regroup, and then decide what to do from there. Then Vettius Scaton and Vitacilius decided that Lafrenius could besiege him by himself, and they had other work to do. Obviously, there's still a massive war on for the Italian peninsula. So they, went on to do their thing, and Lafrenius besieges Pompeius. However, Sulpicius, who, another interesting figure, but, Sulpicius is ordered by Pompeius to sneak around the back of Lafrenius' forces and set their camps on fire. He does this expertisely and causes all of the men of Lafrenius' forces to panic. So Pompeius drives his men out and attacks Lafrenius. In fear, Lafrenius' men retreat to Esculum. Pompeius follows them and lays siege. Now, upon hearing this, Vitacilius, who was from Esculum, just freaks out. He loves his city, doesn't want to see it sieged and taken, so he rushes to try and relieve the siege. He sends a letter to the inhabitants of Esculum. Please, once you see me coming, sally forth. Go out and fight Pompeius, and that way we'll attack him from both sides and crush Pompeius' forces. His spirits are high. He believes he can, lift this siege and save his city. He arrives, moves in to attack Pompeius, ready to see his loyal friends in the city attacking Pompeius. Unfortunately, the people were too afraid. They did not wish to fight Pompeius. And even with the support of Vitacilius there, who was one of the most honorable men, they refused to help him. Vitacilius didn't know what to do, so he fought his way inside his city. And once he got inside, he realized, to his horror and dismay, that they could not hold out a siege for much longer. Vitacilius, in his rage, gathered up all those he thought responsible and murdered them. He then hosted a giant feast with all of his friends, and after the feast was done, drank poison, sat up on a funeral pyre, and ordered them to burn it. Obviously, they end up surrendering to Pompeius, and with that, the rebels have lost probably their second greatest general in this war. Up until this point, the rebels were winning most of their engagements and had taken a lot of territory and had the early jump on the Romans, but this was a disastrous defeat. If Lafrenius and Vitacilius had been able to stop Pompeius, it's very likely they would have won the war. This was a massive victory. Sextus Caesar hears about 20,000 rebels being moved to reinforce, and he decides to ambush them. He kills 8,000 of them. A massive victory for Sextus Caesar, and this one, I can tell you, is definitively Sextus Julius Caesar, because shortly after this big victory, he dies of disease. So, in typical fashion of life, right when you're at your highest, they knock you down. So, Sextus Caesar, huge victory, ambushes and kills 8,000 of these 20,000 men, and promptly says, I've had enough, big dog. Gaius Baebius was appointed in his place as consul, but that's kind of an irrelevant thing. He doesn't do much. At this point, the Umbrians and the Etruscans revolt, and the Senate was so afraid that they actually enlisted freedmen into the service for the first time. So this is the first time ever that slaves in Rome were used as effectively garrison armies. They weren't necessarily put into the armies, but still, this is a massive step in slaves being, admitted into the army. And now, out of the fear of this, we see that they kind of borrow from other cultures, and they release these slaves, put them in their garrison armies. And this really goes to show you, they were afraid. The Romans knew this was a serious threat, and even though they might have not responded so perfectly at the start of the war, once we're in the middle of it, they're like, okay, this is serious. We got to do some drastic measures. So I think it shows you just how good the Italian rebels really were. Anyway, I digress. So now, having the Umbrians and the Etruscans as an enemy, the Senate does something drastic. And I know what you're saying. What's more drastic than permitting slaves into the army? They went to the Etruscans and they went to the Umbrians and they said, we'll give you guys citizenship. If you drop this whole revolt, you'll be granted citizenship. And the Umbrians and the Etruscans immediately accepted that citizenship. And a bunch of other tribes said, hey, well, if they're offering citizenship, yeah, we want that. Now, it's important to note that 10 new tribes were formed for all of the newfound citizens. There was already 35 present in Rome at this time. So adding 10 was not actually going to give these people a vote. So yeah, they'd be citizenships, and they'd have they would definitely get some of the benefits of that. But in terms of voting, they were still just as useless as before, as the original 35 tribes will always have the majority and decide all and any voting. So this 10 new tribes thing was really to placate them, but it worked because they just wanted the citizenship. And, you have to wonder, was it this short-sighted thing? As far as they're like, oh, we'll just accept it. Or did they know, hey, we're kind of getting screwed here, but at least we got one step in the right direction? Impossible for us to really know. But it is worth mentioning that with the addition of the 10 new tribes, that would not have really mattered that much in the voting power of these people. But I digress. So, hearing about the Etruscans revolting, the other rebels sent 15,000 men to aid the Etruscans. They didn't know that the Etruscans had accepted the citizenship, and, Pompeius intercepts this force and kills 5,000 of them and scatters the rest. So, Gnaeus Pompeius, at this point, was elected consul, and he intercepts the 5,000, scatters the rest. As I said, his other consul was Porcius Cato, or Porcius Cato for Anglo, but Cato is the other consul, and he takes over for Lucius Julius Caesar. Now Cato goes to fight the Marsians, and he's having great success against them in this battle. He's destroying them. He's actually winning. He's having great success in this engagement, pushing the Marsians further and further back, and he sees their camp. He storms into the camp, tries to finish them off, and unfortunately, Marsians completely rally back, kill Cato, and defeat his forces. Another consul dead at the hands of the rebels. a miraculous victory for the Marsians. There is some speculation that he was killed by Gaius Marius the Younger, who was the son of Gaius Marius, because Cato was not critical of Gaius Marius, but he would say that his victories and his commands were, on par with Marius's victory over the Cimbri, which is absolutely insane and wrong. But you can say anything. But I don't think Gaius Marius the Younger killed him. I think that's just all political deception. But I digress. Cato is killed by the Marsians, or at the very least killed in that battle, and his forces are defeated, giving the rebels another huge victory. So Sulla was encamped near the Pompeian hills, and Lucius Cluentius pitched his camp very closely to Sulla. And Sulla was incredibly aggravated by this. He thought this massive disrespect from Cluentius. So without waiting, Sulla charges in there and tries to fight Cluentius' forces. And Cluentius is actually having great success, battling them back, beating them. And Sulla starts to think, maybe this wasn't the right idea. And then Cluentius' reinforcements actually get there. And so now Sulla's like, this might not be great. So, yeah, Sulla's fighting Cluentius. They're losing. But then all of the reinforcements for both sides get there. And they're actually able to kind of break the lines of Cluentius. So the remainder of his troops just start retreating. And they fled completely, without the call of Cluentius. This was a broken route. And 3,000 of the men were killed by Sulla's forces. But once they got to Nola, the inhabitants actually only opened one gate because they were so afraid of Sulla's forces raiding into the city that 20,000 more men perished outside from Sulla's forces. So, massive victory. Cluentius himself dies fighting as bravely as he could with his men and trying to protect those who had routed and basically abandoned him. But still, over 20,000 of them slaughtered by Sulla. Again, this is probably one of the biggest victories, on par with the victory over Vitacilius. These two, kind of between Pompeius and Sulla, these are like the two biggest victories. Sulla, having this massive success, keeps going, and he decides to fight against the Herpini next, and he sieges Aculanum. The inhabitants were already, at this point, supposed to get reinforcements from the Lucanians. So they asked Sulla, they said, can we just have some time to think about if we want to surrender? And Sulla, who completely understood what they were doing, as he already had information on the Lucanians' reinforcements, he said, yeah, absolutely, you guys can have time. You guys can have 1 hour. And so, after 1 hour, he set fire to the walls, and immediately the town surrendered. Sulla still plundered the town and murdered many of the inhabitants because they had tried to trick him. Hearing about this, the rest of the Herpini surrendered to Sulla. So at this point, Mutilus, who's been a very good commander for them, gets ambushed. Mutilus' forces get scattered by Sulla, and they regroup, but not in time for Sulla. They regroup, but they're beaten back. And he doesn't completely wipe out that many men, but he does enough of an ambush to scare Mutilus' forces away and give Sulla an in into Samnite territory. So he sieges Bavonum, which is the capital, or it's tough to say the capital because, again, these are all disjointed rebels with their own towns and consuls. But Bavonum was kind of the accepted capital of the rebels, and Sulla was determined to take it. So, after brutal fighting, Sulla takes the city. After he takes Bavonum, he retires to Rome. Pompeius subjugated the Marsians, the Marrucini, and the Vestini. Asconius took many cities and burned Salapia. He killed 15,000 rebels. Even though the rebels got out to a very early start and sieged and betook many cities and got the support of many, many people on their side, the loss of Vitacilius, the loss, Sulla taking down Bavonum was massive. These two things, they were just massive victories. And your last hope is Papadius Silo, or Metellus Pius, as I'll call him, defeats Papadius in battle. And Papadius Silo, the best general of the rebels, perishes in the battle. Every single rebel tribe, except for the Lucanians and the Samnites, were now defeated or accepted citizenship into Rome. Silo's death officially marks the end of the social war. Now, if we're going to get technical, the Lucanians and the Samnites are still, at war, and there's still some battles to be had. But large in part, the war is over, and any effective means or any effective battles are really over. It's done. This is a Roman victory. If you're wondering, the Lucanians and the Samnites accept citizenship when Marius and Cinna have their joint consulship, and they end up accepting citizenship from them. So, which probably was much to the chagrin of Sulla, who hated them. But, that's a story for another day. But effectively, guys, the social war is over with the death of Silo. At this point, it's a Roman victory. What we have to keep in mind here is, yes, it's a Roman victory, but what did the Italians want? Now, obviously, there was a lot of bloodshed on both sides. The Italians killed very many people. The Romans killed very many people also. But the Italians wanted citizenship. That's what they wanted, and they got it. So, yes, the Romans win, but the Romans had their fair share of losses. Rutilius, Cato, there was Capio also. All these men were killed in battle. And many Romans, citizens and supporters, were put to death. And again, property stolen, confiscated, destroyed. It's tough to say who won here, because yes, the Romans technically win the war, and they win the final battles. All of the commanders, essentially all of the commanders, not all, but essentially the commanders of the social war are all killed. Silo, Vitacilius, the two biggest ones. Mutilus survives, but is beat back by Sulla, and all these. So they lose, but their war goal was not like the capture of Rome. The war goal was citizenship, and that's what they said at the start of the war. If you give us citizenship, we won't revolt. And at the end of the day, they got the citizenship. So, yeah, Rome wins, but the Italian, they got what they wanted. So I think this is a tough one. Again, you still have to say Rome won because, yeah, the Italians got the citizenship they wanted, but their votes really still didn't matter. So you were still not equal, which is what they really aspired to be. So I'll give it a victory to Rome, but just know there's a lot of nuance here. All right, so before we get onto the tier list, I just want to have a quick recap. What we have in this war is the Italian people not being granted citizenship and being disgruntled at their non-equal status to that of Romans caused them to revolt. And after a constant period of people trying to support the Italians into citizenship, and them being killed, murdered, banished, so on and so forth, they decided to revolt. As far as for when the war breaks out, the numbers we have, at least in Appian's account, for battles is that the rebels killed 14,200, and the Romans killed, numbers we have, over 50,000 rebels killed in battle. Now, Appian and a few of the sources never really mention any of the siege deaths, and they don't mention the number of Rutilius's forces that were killed. There's a lot of losses that they don't talk about on the Roman side. Through other sources, we can kind of estimate that both sides probably lost 50,000 soldiers around there, and many, many civilians and people were persecuted and put to death in this war. So, and many died as a result of sieges. So this was a very costly war for both sides. Metellus Pius defeats Silo and is killed in combat, and that kind of effectively ends the war. It's technically a Roman victory. what do the Italians want? They wanted citizenship. They got it. So, I mean, this is kind of a war where nobody won and nobody lost. This is just a bad war that ideally shouldn't have happened. So for the rebels, I'm going to. I really want to put them in just because I agree with the principles they've put forth. Like they should, after all they've done to help Rome, be seen as equal and be granted equal citizenship. It's just that you look at the people who were helping them, and most of them resorted to violence. And that, I think, is where all of this kind of stems from. And you might say, and you definitely could make the argument that they had to resort to violence, these people, because they weren't being listened to or they were being undermined in some way. And they felt as though that was their only attempt to salvage any type of quote-unquote victory for themselves. So there's definitely a part of that involved here. But there's so much wrong and evil done. And while I don't disagree with the war goals, and I'm certainly not siding with the Romans in not granting these people citizenship, I just don't think this was the way to go about it. I really want to put them in just because once the war starts, the rebels do send the envoys to Rome and say, hey, we'll shut this whole revolt down if we're granted citizenship, and the Senate refuses. So it's tough, but prior to this, you've already exchanged the hostages. There's been bad blood for years and years in the political field between these two factions, and ultimately the rebels do kind of strike first and cause this war with the murder of Quintus Servilius. So with them killing Servilius, it's tough. You were trying to conceal your hostage sharing and your treason, and you killed a man to defend that. That's not great. Other people have been killed in your cause. That's not great. We still don't really know who killed Livius Drusus. It could have been either faction. That's not great. Also, in Asculum, after killing Servilius, they killed all the Roman supporters, stole their property, and that's happens throughout the whole war. Anytime the rebels kind of win, any Roman sympathizers or Roman citizens within the city are murdered. So it's really tough to give them just. And I'm not saying that the Romans were just. I'm just saying I think I don't want to put them. I'm going to put them in watch it play because I don't think that their end goals were unjust. And I do think that they tried to do a lot of things right and offering that kind of not necessarily peace to the Senate, but that ultimatum like, hey, give us citizenship and we'll stop the revolt. That is just, and they were in the right to do such. They were in the right to do so, but I just think, there's just too much treachery and things to go on to put this above watch it playa. And for Rome, I'm also going to put it in watch it playa. I can't put it in just because there was so much buildup in this war, and so many times this could have been quelled and fixed. It's tough because, in some sense, they're both justified. And what I mean by that is you have the Italian non-citizens who just want to be equal to the Romans. And then you have the Romans who have seen this kind of blooming of the plebeian class, they have this blooming of the plebeian class that's, disrupting their way of life, and their form of authority. So you're kind of justified in quelling that because you don't know what the outcome of that will be. I mean, what is the influx of, doubling your population of citizens? It could be catastrophic. So, both sides are just, I think, in their general war aims. But I can't put them in just because they both are treacherous and they both do things in the build up to this war that are just wrong. So I can't with good conscience put either one in just. I think both of them had noble aims, but went about them in the wrong way. For the Gracchi brothers, I am going to, because of Gracchus, I'm going to put them in just. The younger Gracchus, he was just too. He was, I mean, and he had seen what they did to his brother, so I'm gonna give him a pass. It's tough because all they wanted was to help the poor Italians. And as tribune of the plebs, I mean, that's your job. You're looking after the plebeian class. So they were just doing literally what they were called to do. And then the nobles, again, forbid Gracchus, the elder Gracchus, from running for tribune. So his supporters freak out and cast out the candidates. They have a small revolt. They're all killed and thrown into the Tiber. So yeah, you shouldn't have revolted, but it was wrong to forbid him from running for tribune. So I can't fault him for that. Um, and his reforms, while definitely good-hearted, I agree also that they were impractical. I mean, how are you going to just divide up this land? It's just not a feasible thing to do. As for the younger, I also think he was just, and you have to factor in knowing what they did to his brothers and his decision. Obviously, once once Drusus kind of takes popularity away from him and they have to kind of go make this African colony, revokes permission of that colony, which causes, not necessarily by his design, a murder in the Senate. Now, they did go there with daggers. They did have a sort of a plan to revolt. So it's very hard for me to just completely abdicate responsibility from Gracchus. I would probably put the younger. I'm going to leave him in just because, like I said, they murdered his brother. So his was a little bit more of a planned revolt that was a little bit more, I would say, wrong. But I'm going to still put them in just nonetheless. Now we move on to Saturnius Glaucia. I really feel as though both of these men, yes, they were certainly populist and they were adjacent to the Gracchi movement, and obviously Saturnius and Glaucia were kind of friends with Gaius Marius, and Marius threw in his lot with them because all of them shared the common interest of being for the plebeians. And Saturnius was tribune for the plebs, Marius tribune for the plebs. And so these men, all kind of had the same goals in mind. But I would argue that especially Saturnius and Glaucia, it wasn't really so much the plebeian righteousness that they sought, but their own political power. And for that reason, it's kind of hard. It's really hard for me to accept them as just, because everything they did was, while it was trying to stick up for the populist, it was very shady. I mean, Saturnius forcing the clause into his agrarian law, not to mention the murder of Nonius, not to mention Glaucia's murder of Memmius. These guys were incredibly corrupt, and they just felt as though their ends justified the means, or perhaps it was all an elaborate scheme for their own power. I find Saturnius and Glaucia to be unjust, and I think number one, the political assassination of anybody is incorrect and wrong. But furthermore, I find, just in general, I believe them not to really truly be Gracchi supporters, but they only are pushing their own self-interest. And they kind of taint the reputation of a man like Marius, who was from humble beginnings and kind of threw in his lots with them because they believed similar things. But, I think he saw how far they were willing to go and the corruption that they would be okay with, and he wasn't okay with that. I just find Saturnius and Glaucia, at best, misguided, at worst, evil, and I'm going to put them in unjust. Flaccus, he's a tough case because, he latches on with the Gracchi brothers, and, all he really wants to do is give the Italian citizenship. He's kind of the first person to really inspire that idea in them. Marcus Livius Drusus is going to get credit for that, but he kind of fosters that idea, and he, falls in line with the younger Gracchi and tries to make this work. It's tough. I'm going to put him in just. Now, the colony falls. Everything that kind of goes wrong is outside of his control. It was the younger Gracchi who effectively gave the order to murder the senators, or murder the opposition. It was the younger Gracchi who ordered the men to go into the Senate with the daggers. Yes, it kind of, according to the younger Gracchi brother and the story we have, even though they technically planned a revolt if they didn't get their way, the signal was never cast from them. They're kind of putting blame on the mob, which is kind of ironic because, your whole political platform is, we need to give the populist rule. And then, the irony is that allowing, your mob to, I guess, use their own means of deciphering the plan led to your death. Little irony there, but and I find it a little funny. But either way, Flaccus, he was a just guy. He was just trying to get these guys citizenship, and at the end of the day, it just didn't work out for them. Marcus Livius Drusus, I'm gonna put him in fair enough. I don't think Marcus Livius Drusus is unjust. He wanted political support, kind of really pushed the idea of Italian citizenship, built colonies. I mean, he was doing what he could for the populist and still kind of remaining true to the Roman nobility, and trying to be as down the middle as he could. That absolutely split him apart and did not work for him and led to his assassination. And we don't know whether he was assassinated by plebes or by the nobility. We really don't know. My guess, it's tough to say, and I'm unsure. If I really had to make a guess, I would say the nobility killed him, or the knights. But I think it is very, we don't know. And it could have been the plebeian class who were very disgruntled with Drusus because he didn't get them citizenship. So, and obviously the nobles who see him sparking this desire for citizenship are equally as upset with him. So, but I'm going to put him in fair enough. I don't necessarily think he did anything too wrong. I'm going to put him in just, actually. I'm going to change my mind. I was going to but I'll put him in just. He doesn't really do anything wrong. I mean, the guy just gets assassinated. So, fine. Scipio Aemilianus, I'm also going to put in just. This is the guy that I feel the worst for. I'm sorry. There's somebody I feel a little bit worse for, but I would feel worse for him, but he pulls a fast one. But Scipio Aemilianus, this is a hero. This is probably the most distinguished man in Rome at the time, and unfortunately for him, they want him to, and he's married to he's married into the Gracchi family. So he's got this pressure of the nobility who helped him achieve his success, and he's got the pressure of his literal family splitting him in two, and he doesn't know who to side with. And so, he's kind of not necessarily bribed, but coerced, and because of the favors the nobility did for him, he in turn has to help them out here. So he does. He goes and he says, "Hey, look, I like Gracchus law. I think it's actually good. We should be, redistributing this land. But how could we possibly do it? The implementation is completely flawed." And so he sets up and so Teutotonus, gets given the position to redistribute the land, and, he realizes there's no way to do this. It's going to be impossible. So he just goes and incites a war and goes and fights some border enemies, and I can't possibly do that job. I got a million other things going on. So I would honestly, if I was going to put Teutotonus anywhere, I'd put him in I'd put him in fair enough. I mean, they burdened him with that, and he realized it was impossible. But again, Scipio Aemilianus, he tried to solve this issue. It just didn't work out, and literally the day as he's about to give his speech and try and sort this, he dies. So it's like he gets knocked a lot. His reputation is destroyed because kind of both sides are aggravated at him, much like all of the other people who just were in the middle. You got torn apart by the two sides, and because he died and wasn't able to kind of give a definitive answer one way or the other, his reputation kind of falls with him, and it's kind of a sad end to one of Rome's heroes. But I digress. I'll put him in just. Metellus Macedonius and Metellus Pius, absolutely both these guys are going in just high up. Macedonius accepts his banishment without causing any war, which is incredibly honorable. And his son constantly campaigns to bring his father back and still fights in these wars against the rebels. Obviously, that's something he would have wanted to do anyway. Wasn't a fan of these people and was not on the side of the he was obviously, both of these men were very well liked and respected by the nobles of Rome. But yeah, I mean, I think both of them are just. I think they carry themselves exceedingly well and in a great manner. Both of them perform very well with their military victories, respectively. Macedonius in his own campaigns, and Pius in the social war, effectively wins the war and ends it. So, very just, very honorable men. Mutilus, he's actually, I believe, the only major general from the social war to survive. And he's granted citizenship after, but I think he just was he ends up terminating his lease on life because he's just, kind of over it. But I think Mutilus was a just general. I thought he carried himself well and just lost to the might of Sulla. Nothing to be ashamed of there. Cato, yeah, I mean, fair enough. You were elected consul, you tried to fight, and you died. You were having some success, you stormed a camp, and it ended in your death. Fair enough, I'm not going to put you in just. But whatever, you're fair enough. Sulla, now we're getting to the real complicated guys. I'm going to say that Sulla's actions were just, specifically referring to the social war, not counting the Mithridatic War, not counting the March on Rome, not counting any of that, not considering any of that, just his victories in the social war and his approach to it. He was justified in it. Marius, same thing. Just for the social war, he was just, and I think he. I didn't bring this up, but if you watch the Life of Marius video or the Cimbrian War video, you'd know that during the social war, he steps down and says, "I can no longer command the men. I'm too infirm," and he relinquishes that leadership power, which again is kind of the reason that Sulla's popularity skyrockets. As I touched upon in that video, they were rivals and did not like one another. And as you see, just to reference, Marius was friends with Saturnius and Glaucia. He was friends with all of the populace. So, and Sulla was kind of that champion of nobility, so, or at least the conservative values. So they were really at odds, butting heads the entire time. And they had to team up, and they have a great victory over the margins. And, Marius has a few other victories. Sulla has the bulk of the massive victories in this war. Yeah, but Marius steps down. I think that was an honorable thing to do, though. He realized, hey, I cannot command these men. Was that partially, too, because perhaps he agreed with the rebels? There's certainly a case that could have been possible. But either way, I consider Marius' actions very just. He has a lot of great moments in the war, even at his old age. Scattering Scatton's camp, and just having that little ring around the rosy with Silo, as well as his victory over the margins. I think you really have to put Marius in just. He did the best he could with all these conflicting interests for himself. Sextus Caesar, yeah, I mean, just. I'm gonna put Sextus and Lucius in the same thing. They're both just. They were just elected consul, did what they could. Sextus obviously dies of disease. We don't know which ones really did what battles. I'd say Lucius was responsible for the first two, and Sextus the rest. Either way, doesn't matter. I'd say they both unjust. One of somebody that I'm gonna put both Sulla and Marius over Mutilus. Or Mutilius. Yeah. Silo. I'm gonna put Silo above all these guys. I mean, honestly. Yeah. Just, he wanted citizenship. He was the best general for them. Destroyed Capio's forces, probably knew about the arrogance. He did literally know about how much Capio's father, who was responsible for Aruzio, kind of haunted Capio, and he used that against them incredibly effectively. Just a very smart military mind, and you'd like to see what he could have done in the coming civil wars. It would have been great to have that guy around and see what he could have done, but unfortunately, Metellus kills him. But I give him just all of the rebels. It's kind of, they were very, very vicious to the towns that surrendered, or to the towns rather that they besieged. But a lot of the towns that they surrendered them, they took those men into their service and were very kind to. It's like the same thing happens to the Romans. When towns that they had to siege, they were very, very ruthless to. But towns that were, freely given citizenship or accepted, surrender, were kind of laid off for the most part. So it's like both sides did the same things. It's very hard to blame one general or another for a specific interaction when both sides were doing the same things. But I digress. Silo put him in just. Scatton, I'm also going to put him in just. Yeah, he was also a very good general. Just, gets beaten. So Scatton, or Vidius, wins a great victory over Rudolus, but then is kind of outmaneuvered by Marius. What are you going to do? You got outmaneuvered by the most experienced general alive. And then he wins another victory against one of the Julius Caesars, probably Lucius, and sieges Acernia. So he does a lot of great stuff, and unfortunately, just the war bogged down. He wasn't able to win this war just with his forces alone. But they did a very good job. They were ultimately defeated. Pompeius's men and his men have kind of a standoff, and he ends up surrendering and committing suicide to avoid capture. But I think he was just. I mean, for suicide, maybe I'll put him in fair enough. But yeah, I'm happy with that. All right. Vitacilius, again, another guy who commits suicide, so you're gonna get put in fair enough. You're gonna get put above Scaton though, because he just wanted to save Asculum, his hometown. All he wanted was to save it, and he just couldn't. Very sad. Breaches into the walls. Now, I'm actually gonna put him below. He does punish the people he thought were responsible. Didn't really have proof for that. Was just like, you're a political dissident. Kill him. Which, they probably all were going to get killed either way from the Romans. But, yeah, Vitacilius just tried to save his town and ultimately couldn't, and so he committed suicide. We're going to put him in. Yeah, we'll just leave him in fair enough. The guy, overwhelming odds, was really struggling. It is what it is. Lafrenius. So, Lafrenius, is sieging Pompeius, and Scuddon and Vitacilius leave him to do it. They're like, yeah, you got it. You're gonna beat Pompeius. And it's not how that goes, because Sulpicius comes behind them, burns the camp, and slaughters them all, killing Lafrenius himself. So yeah, he's a just guy, just was working, doing his best, and got absolutely routed by Sulpicius. Rudolus, again, another just guy, was a consul of Rome, defeated by Scatton and killed. What are you gonna do? Sometimes you win some, you lose some. Pompeius was incredibly just. He's up here right towards the top of all these guys. Did the best he could. Was a massive influential figure in this war. And obviously his son, Pompey the Great, must have drawn a lot of inspiration and honor from this. But a great performance from Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo. Capio, I want to put him in unjust just because of the family tree there of grandfather assassinates a Roman enemy just to raise his own record, even though the war is over. Your father cost one of the worst Roman defeats in history. So it's you're just trying to get over that shame. And he was initially having success when he takes over Rudulus's forces. He was actually having a pretty good amount of success, but it just, obviously the play by Silo, ambushing him and tricking him,
is what leads to his defeat. And because he was so reckless and just like, oh, I want to win this war, I want my glory, and in his mind, you have to think both of your family members are kind of shamed, especially your father. So if you win this social war or you have a massive victory, it's like you wipe away all that stain. And so that's what, I think led him to fall for the ruse by Silo. And unfortunately, that ended up costing him his life and his legacy. But nonetheless, I don't think he was unjust. I think his kind of ambition to revoke that stain on his family is what led to his death. That's why I'm going to put him in fair enough and not quite just. And very last, we have Ignatius, who's just going to go in just. Yeah, it's not much to say. Fought well, won some battles, lost some battles. What are you going to do? Really what I think is important to note here is that most of the people involved in this war were not bad people by any means. They were not evil. They just were competing for their own goals and interest and what they believed was right. And then you have people caught in the middle, like Marius, like Drusus, these guys and Scipio, Aemilianus, these guys who really, they kind of see both sides and they don't know what it is. They get split. I think it's just a tough thing, and both sides were, on the brink of evil because they both do a lot of bad things, but the individual men are just trying their best in the circumstance they're given, and I can't put them, really anyone, below fair enough. No one does, these crazy acts of treachery, nobody does anything completely evil. I mean, obviously murder and that's why Saturnius and Glaucia are down there for the assassinations. But that's evil and unjust. But it's like, within the confines of this war, I think all of the men that were involved, the generals, were just and did the best they could. This is really just kind of a very sad war because it did not need to happen. I mean, you have Italian peasants who are growing poorer and poorer and poorer. And this is a war. I might just, not to get on the soapbox, but in the modern day, we have a lot to learn from this war. You look at the rich getting richer and richer and richer, employing cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, effectively slave labor. The regular everyday guy is getting poorer and poorer. Unemployment is up. Desirable jobs are gone. No matter how hard you work or what degrees you get, you end up nowhere. So and that breeds discontent. And eventually, with people trying to get power back to the people and get them back to an economic station that is more desirable, and ultimately, every attempt is shut down by the rich because they don't want to lose their position. And not only that, but then you have the pragmatist in the Roman side who just think that kind of opening themselves up to this populist democracy is not going to end well. And they're not necessarily wrong either. So both sides are correct in their ideas, but you see this just boiling over until it burst. And the reality is this is something that could have been solved. I'm not saying it would have been easy. I'm not saying that at all. But ultimately, we just sent thousands and thousands, over 100,000 at least, people died in this war. For what? For the Italians to get citizenship and the Romans to concede it. I mean, it's all just nothing. It's just a waste of life, guys. That's why I kind of, it's tough. I don't blame the individual men involved, but, you have to take a step back and look at this war as just one of the examples of why this is why you have to listen to your people, because on both sides, if you're unwilling to listen and try and come to a adequate solution, it boils over into violence, and that is exactly what happens in the social war. So you have all these competing interests, and it just explodes into this completely ludicrous war that did not need to happen. It's honestly, I think, one of the more sad things that happened in Rome, just when you think about the loss of life. Obviously, at the end of the day, this was technically progress for the Italians who got their citizenship. Granted, it didn't mean much because their vote still didn't matter, but this is a step in the right direction. It just cost many, many lives, and I don't think at the end of the day we should be celebrating or happy about one life so being sacrificed. So ultimately, this is the tier list. This is one of the most interesting wars in the end of the Republic, and I hope you guys learned something. I hope you guys were intrigued by it. I hope you see all this powder keg that leads to it and are as interested by it as I am. And please, feel free to keep doing your own research, to do your own research on this. It's one of the coolest parts of Roman history. Just, all of this from Marius all the way through Sulla and through Caesar is some of the most interesting parts in Roman history. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed it.